Greetings, my name is Jeff Welpley. I am the CTO of GetHuman. Some of my fellow GetHuman developers are back there supporting me on. Thanks, guys. I am also the host of the Angular podcast. I'm a contributor to Angular Core, and I am the co-organizer of the local Angular meetup along with Sharon Diorio, who I think is in the room. How many people, actually, I'm just curious, have attended the local Angular meetup before? So, okay, great. We got a couple of different, all right, great. A couple of good representatives here. Wicked Pissa, very nice. So, obviously, I'm here today to talk about Angular. More specifically, I want to give everybody some context about what's been happening in the Angular community, where we got to where we are today, and then a little bit of a look forward of what's going to be happening down the road. And it is really an amazing time to be alive right now. There are some crazy things going on. With the release of Angular 2 just this past 2 weeks ago, with NativeScript, with so many things happening in the community, I could talk for hours about all the amazing stuff happening in the JavaScript community. But first, I want to take a step back. All right. I want to take a step back and go back 4 years ago to when I first started working with Angular. And I don't know if there was Angular 1 people who raised their hand before. Did anybody go back to like 2012, 2011 when it first came out? Okay, Sharon, a couple other people. Not too many, okay. So in my opinion, that was like the golden era of Angular. Because at that time, if you guys remember, there was Backbone and jQuery, which were like really the only two major players. There was a couple other ones, but nothing really that big. And then Angular hit the scene, and you could do something like this, which was, back then, really beautiful, where you just had the same HTML document and everything was right there, which even without maybe even being exposed to Angular 1 for some of you, you could probably parse through this and kind of understand what was going on. It was just very simple to get started, especially with the Hello World. And that was really the magic of the original version of Angular. It got everybody into the language really quickly, got them started, and you got this immediate sense of satisfaction that you were able to do some amazing things. So we go from back in 2012, where we just had this one simple HTML file and everything inside it, to today's world where, yes, there's all these amazing things, great, but I mean, it is really, really hard to get into this because there's so much to learn. I mean, where are you going to start? When you have to create just one app, you have to know about TypeScript, you have to know about Webpack, you have to know about a million other technologies that you may have not been exposed to, and it is intimidating. It's hard. You don't get that initial feeling that I got back in the day when Angular 1 was first introduced, where you just immediately got something working, right? That's extremely hard to do. So it really comes down to this balance, really, of power versus simplicity, that there is a lot of great things that happen when it's simple, when you kind of get people on board. Angular 1 proved that. That's the reason why there was so much adoption. But it sort of was lacking. The people who did start to utilize Angular 1, they ran into issues. Once you started building these larger apps on top of it, with the digest cycle and some of the, certain performance issues, certain bottlenecks that you had to work around. So it wasn't necessarily perfect, right? Now they're adding all these other tooling on because of adding these additional powers, the ability to do NativeScript, the ability to server render, all this other stuff that is great. I mean, it is amazing, like I said, but it comes at a cost sometimes. It creates more complexity. It adds more overhead. It makes things harder to begin with. So what do we do about this? How do we balance these two things? Trying to get both is very difficult. And that's why I want to kind of talk about a little bit the difference and what's been happening here in this transition between Angular 1 and Angular 2. How many people have heard of the original story of why and how Angular 1 was created? Does anybody know about that at all? Okay, so good. Yeah, and a couple people. I know Sharon, So Mishko was working at Google. Mishko's the creator of Angular. And at that time, there were designers on their team who just wanted to do mock-ups, really. They were working on a bunch of different products, and he was tasked with just enabling these set of designers within Google to just create these mock-ups quicker. And they wanted them to be somewhat functioning, right? So They could do HTML, CSS, and they knew some JavaScript, but it was really hard to like just get simple things, working. So he basically designed Angular 1 very specifically to make the lives of these designers easy. He didn't build it for you or me. He didn't build it for the millions of people that actually use Angular today, Angular 1. He built it for a set of like non-developers, basically, people who just peripherally knew some like basic level JavaScript. But in a way, it was brilliant at that time because there were some barriers there in getting people involved in client-side app development, and it broke down all those barriers. It got everybody in the door and involved. So from that sense, it was like absolutely brilliant. But because it was originally designed, not necessarily for hardcore development, that's where, as you started to build these larger apps on top of, Angular 1, you ran into these different pitfalls. So, I mean, it wasn't like the team didn't notice that. They did start, evolving, iterating on Angular 1, but there was this realization that, look, like, from just the low-level foundation of what we built, it is lacking, and that was sort of exacerbated when things like React came out. So React came out, about 2 years ago, and a year and a half ago, something like that, and has gained a lot of popularity because it sort of it was designed and built for developers from day one. It fulfilled a lot of the needs that maybe Angular 1 wasn't fulfilling. And the team saw that and they said, well, okay, let's rethink this. And they could have gone down, a number of different paths. They could have just kept on iterating until they got some of those features. But there were some things that were just really hard to do that, Angular 1, for example, because of just their original mentality, was tightly coupled to the DOM, for example. Whereas like something like React is like specifically built to be decoupled from the DOM. So there's like two very drastic differences, and it's hard to iterate on a framework that's like so tightly coupled in Angular 1 to kind of provide the same level of things. So ultimately they decided to just basically rebuild everything from the ground up, which in retrospect is sort of this natural inclination, I think, of all developers. I think all of us, like, that's the normal thing I know for myself that I think of is like, if there's these problems, let's just rebuild it, right? It's hard, it takes a lot of discipline to actually like keep stair-stepping towards something. So, but in any effect, they started rebuilding. It took a long time. It's basically been 3 years, essentially, since they started working on Angular 2, this like grand rework of the framework. And what's resulted is this sort of mix of a couple different things. So first of all, it does have a number of things from Angular 1. There are certain things that it's not, even though the code was a total rewrite, there's a lot of concepts that are the same. Namely, things like dependency injection and change detection, things like having this DSL in your HTML. Those were all part of the original Angular 1. They still are, key part of Angular 2. But a really, really important distinction, with Angular 1 and maybe even some of the other frameworks out now, like React, is that Angular 1 was originally conceived and is still with Angular 2 as this all-in-one framework. The idea being that to simplify things for developers, because you didn't have to make all these choices for all this other stuff. You can just use all the stuff that's built into the framework. So things like animations, for example. Like, sure, you could have a whole set of different animations libraries that the people in the community create, and in some sense that's good, but it's in another sense it creates this like parity of choice, analysis paralysis, and is that all that stuff even better, or would it be better of kind of focusing people's attention and building it just as part of the framework? So there is a balance there for sure, but for certain things like animations, like internationalization, like a couple other things, it is part of this kind of all-in-one package. And that makes it very different than something like React, which is more of like minimalistic and kind of choose your own. But there was a lot of things that were taken from React because at the end of the day, they made a lot of really good decisions. Number one being, like I mentioned, decoupled from the DOM. That is like a huge game changer. That allowed them to do so many things, be so flexible. And actually, just like another interesting story about that is that at the original NGConf, which was 2 years ago, I remember 3 years ago, sorry. I was talking to Mishko, and at that time, I had built with Angular 1 my own kind of server rendering framework completely outside Angular just for our own needs at Get Human. And I remember talking to Mishko about like, hey, we should try to like work on something like this in the Angular 1 code base. And the response from him and Brad were kind of like, no, like we're focused just on, web browser client-side development. That's our thing. Like we don't, who cares about all this other stuff, And like that was kind of their mindset back then because that's sort of where they grew up from. But fast forward I think it only took like another year after that with the launch of React, with a lot of growing sentiment in the community of wanting more, wanting to build on one framework but then be able to utilize it in different places. I think they did come around, and ultimately they designed and built as a core tenet of Angular 2 this same decoupling, same type of decoupling between how the framework works and then what is the target environment, basically the browser, or with native script the mobile device, or with the stuff that I work on with Angular Universal, a web server for SEO purposes. So you can build in this same framework, but like run it in many different places. So that is like super powerful and something that literally was, I don't think would have happened without the influence of React. And then obviously, just the component architecture and data flow, using things like Redux, like enabling, one-way data flow instead of, having everything two-way data binded. There was a lot of concepts there that are baked into Angular 2 that, really weren't in Angular 1. But then there's been a lot of innovations, it's not just taking from these other frameworks, but it's also stuff that even though it's just launched, like officially released, Angular 2 has already, even in pre-release, created many innovations that have been pushing the web forward, pushing all these other frameworks to improve what they've been doing. So, a couple of them that have been really, really game-changing in my opinion is things like AOT compilation. So like that's ahead-of-time compilation. It means when you essentially build the framework in such a way that it can be pre-compiled, at build time, to create more optimized data structures when you deploy. So at the end of the day, it basically cuts out all the cruft of your code, all the stuff that actually isn't needed, that you can basically, anything you can do ahead of time, at build time, you do it then, for optimizing your templates, optimizing, objects, like sharing objects between, different paths. And then when your code's actually running, it's a lot smaller. Like the actual size of Angular 2 is extremely small. And it's a lot faster because it doesn't have to use, for example, the compiler, which is like 60% of the framework. The compiler within Angular 2 is like 60% of the framework, but it's just completely removed because you pre-compile everything and it's not even needed. So that's pretty huge. They actually, for lazy loading, for the people that were in down here yesterday, I sort of mentioned this a little bit, but they introduced the thing ng module. And one of the things that's always been, for me, like kind of an annoying thing that not having the ability of easily lazy loading your app, like of specifying that for an initial view when a client looks at your app, that you should only have to download just the resources for that view and then everything else kind of download in the background. And you can do that yourself, very easily, and not very easily, but you can do it. But the key with what they built with Angular 2 is a mechanism so that you can do it through the framework and it handles like everything underneath the scenes. And in a very similar way with web workers, you can use web workers yourself, but just a show of hands, how many people actually use web workers in their code today? All right, there's one person. Okay, there you go. One guy in this room. It's not, like earth-shattering or whatever to write the code to do it, but nobody does it. And it's hugely beneficial to run stuff when you can off, thread, as long as the kind of communication penalty isn't that great. So they've set things up in Angular 2 where just as by default, the configuration flag, it'll just work, where everything will run in a separate web worker. And that immediately frees up the UI thread and makes things potentially faster. And then some of the stuff that I've been working on with Universal and the idea of just like they've been really pushing into TypeScript and they were actually, from what I can see, the first framework who like made TypeScript a first-class citizen, and then a whole bunch of other frameworks like Aurelia, like Ember kind of followed afterwards. Now, speaking of other frameworks, there is one other sort of like redheaded stepchild of the framework wars here, which is Ember. And to be honest, I've tried Ember before. It's like a personal taste thing, and I think for my own purposes, it's always been, I've seen the good value in Ember and that community, but like I haven't seen anything like different except for when you come to like one major thing, which is they, more than any other of the JavaScript frameworks, embraced conventions, embraced this idea of eliminating the ambiguity with all of the kind of monotonous stuff that occurs with app development. It's one thing to talk about like, your core business functionality, but there's a lot of stuff like file naming, how you structure your code, how you make HTTP calls, all this stuff, which, sure, there's a million different ways you could do it, but why? Why would you, it's fine to allow that, but there's sort of this overhead that occurs when you are creating an app and you have all this choice. And Ember made the very smart decision of just saying, no, you can if you want to, but this is the Ember way. This is the way that we want everybody to do things. And the people that use Ember love it because of that. And that is something that Angular 2 is definitely embracing as well. And this came originally, for people that are from the Ember world know this, that the creators of Ember are from the Rails world, and really it's Rails popularized this idea as well. And DHH, who is the creator of Rails, is famous for saying your application is not a snowflake, meaning that you think that the stuff you're doing is special and unique, but in reality, there's so much of it that is the same as what everybody else is doing, so why keep on duplicating the same thing? Conventions free us from this deliberation, these silly discussions with our teammates about certain like small standards. Why even waste your time? Just let's work on it once as a community and then free our minds to actually work on the hard problem. And the other thing is they provide a way of creating higher level abstractions on top of these conventions. Because once you say that like everybody knows that all Angular 2 apps, let's say, are structured in a particular way, you can start building tooling and other things on top of it. And that's where the CLI comes in. The CLI is essentially the codification of all of these standards and best practices and conventions. And it can be extremely powerful. I actually have been working the past couple weeks on a part of the CLI that is used with the library that I focus on for Angular Universal, which is the server rendering library. It is still under works at Angular Connect next week. I'm sort of under the gun to basically show demos of like all this stuff. But just for the purpose of, I think I wanted to give more of like an overview in this talk, and frankly, it's not working yet. But no, I do want to mention just for the concepts of what's involved in the CLI, the important part in my mind is that you're taking what everybody kind of agrees on, or like the current state of what people think are the best ways to do things, and you're having a tool that enforces it. So to build your initial code for scaffolding, for checking your existing code to see if there's anything out of sync, and then giving you kind of like warnings, like lint-like warnings, right? As well as things change. And this is like where it really gets powerful with the CLI, moving forward in the Angular 2 world, is that as the API changes, as the standards change and evolve over time, one thing that's being built into the CLI is this idea of migration, is the idea of if you stay up to date, with the latest version of Angular, then with the CLI, it will guide you along. So, there is probably the biggest complaint, to be frank, with Angular 2 is because it's such a departure from Angular 1, and the developers that even use Angular 1, you have to kind of relearn all this stuff, learn all this new stuff, and it can be a big gap. Even though, like it was mentioned earlier, they have started to build a lot of stuff in Angular 1 to kind of close that gap, but there still is a gap, okay? But once you get to Angular 2, they have made big efforts with this tooling so that in the future, it will be easier to just iterate along as the framework evolves, as all these new features are added, as even the conventions change. Because that's the thing, is that we don't know right now what is the best way. There is a certain set of conventions that are part of the CLI right now that it tries to like pick up on, but not many people have apps in production yet. It just was released, right? And it's like one of those things that you don't know until it's out there. So that's why they found it important that as long as it can evolve, then as people start to build production apps, they'll have certain other opinions, things will change, and even the conventions are going to be different. But if you buy in now, you will see that, and you will be able to evolve along with the rest of the community. And so what comes next? There's tons of, just from a feature perspective, tons of amazing things that are coming down the line. Related to the CLI, besides the stuff that I'm like working on for Angular Universal in the CLI, there are a lot of things to enable it to be more pluggable, which is like one of the biggest things we're trying to work on now, so that you have a lot of customized things within your own build environment, just so that it works easily with all the general CLI stuff that everybody's using. There's a lot of other features for things like Angular Material and animations and all these other little areas, like I said, for trying to keep everything in this all-in-one package, so that you as developers can buy into the ecosystem, buy into like this idea of Angular, and know that there's other people that are going to help you, that basically the framework itself and the community is built for now and for moving forward around this idea of us all kind of working together on this. So that's where I think when it comes to conventions and what's coming next, the most important thing in my mind is everybody kind of coming together on this. That, yeah, we'll have all sorts of crazy features. We'll have all sorts of additional innovative stuff that's going to occur. But what's really going to make Angular 2 and Angular, moving forward, Angular 3 and 4 and everything else going down the road, what's going to make it super successful is you guys. It is the work that you guys do, and doing it in a way that you're helping each other out, that you're building as a community, that we're working together to develop these standards and improve them. So I encourage you guys to embrace this sort of direction. If it doesn't work, that doesn't mean that everything isn't perfect, but if it doesn't work, then instead of just kind of kicking to the curb, then give your opinions, contribute. Like, we want to hear your voices. And ultimately, that'll lead to a better life for all of us. So, including NativeScript and Angular Native. So, thanks a lot, guys. That's it. I don't know if we have time for questions, or I could do it in the back. Yeah, okay. So, any questions that anybody has? Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So as a general thing, like if you like just like a feed of like raw information, the Gitter for Angular is super active, and like you'll see like stuff in real time. So if you go to gitter.im/angular/angular, that is like the best like raw feed. But if you watch the GitHub repo for the Angular CLI, like just put a watch on it, that is going to be extremely helpful, because there is a lot of work going on that. In fact, there's going to be a major change tomorrow, I believe. They're trying to get everything in for Angular Connect. So if you kind of keep an eye on that, you'll see all the discussion of kind of what's being changed, what's going to be included in that set of fixes and all that type of stuff. So yeah, GitHub and then the Gitter channel. What's that? Oh, it's for tutorials? Well, the documentation is actually pretty good, the Angular.io documentation. But I think I think some of like the online tutorials, like the Egghead.io and like that type of thing, have held back a little bit because there's been so much change recently. They've kind of held off. But I think you're going to start to see more of that within the next like month or so. It was just released, like for Angular. Oh, they did? A couple of days ago, they released a lot of them. Oh, okay. There you go. Thanks. All right. Anyone else? I'll be in the back if you have any other questions. All right. Thanks a lot, guys.